And welcome to this week's video. My name is Fazila Bijo. On this channel, I bring through teachings and explore concepts and practices and principles so that you can become a manifester of your reality. In this week's video, I will be covering chapter 2 of The Law and the Promise is Dwell Therein, and it is part 2. It is a case study that covers how Mrs JRB created her wonderful stately mansion. Before we go into the case study, I will be covering a couple of aspects that Neville highlights in the chapter, things that I didn't highlight before. And in this week, I just want you to hone in on and focus on what it means for you to become someone who can imagine better than the best. Now, it does start with your assumption, but it's also got to do with you consistently holding in imagination, living from the wish fulfilled, living from the feeling of the wish fulfilled. So this week, I want to take you through a couple of concepts, and then we'll go into the case study where I will point out what you can do when you're wanting to create your ideal home. So if you're wanting to manifest your dream home, I recommend you sit down and construct a scene that would be simple, natural, and imply that you are living in your dream home. So pause the video, take the time and write it out, because when we get to the case study, what you're going to find are pointers that will help you to actually create a better scene. It will help you to see how someone else who's been successful at doing this, and she did it over 4 nights, by the way, in terms of bringing this property through from being in imagination to seeing it happen for her. So I really encourage you, these case studies help us. There's a collection of people's stories who have successfully applied the law of assumption. Now, on this channel, I have been focused on Neville's teachings because they are so powerful. If you're really wanting to master manifestation and creating your reality, learn the law of assumption, apply the practices, become a master at it. I will be bringing teachings through and exploring teachings from other teachers like Joseph Murphy, Florence Scovel-Shinn, and a lot of the other contemporaries of that time. Their works have been so profound that all you need to, number one, do is read, study, apply. And in your application, if you are consistent and persistent, I promise you, your dreams will manifest. Like I have seen with mine, I started really dedicating and committing my time and my focused attention to Neville's works in 2021. And 3 years later, my life does not feel or look the same. I did start out with Joseph Murphy and Florence Scovel-Shinn and a few others, and I still continue to use their works because they give me something different, and I will be bringing that into the channel and into my future videos. So for this week, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on some of the points that Neville covers in the rest of this chapter, and then we'll get into the case study. I trust you have constructed your imaginal scene for your dream home. If you haven't, you still have time in order to do that, at least until we get to the case study. Neville says in this chapter that adopt the way of imagination or the way of sense. Now, the way of sense is relying on your senses to tell you what is real or not. And that is very limiting because all your senses are going to give you is an input of what's going on in your outside reality, and it's not about what it is that you are controlling. Your senses can only tell you what is outside of you. It is up to you now to adopt the way of imagination, and in doing so, you can direct your senses to fuse and become directed by your imagination. Because when everyone, each person can finally identify themselves with imagination rather than their senses, they will discover the core of reality is imagination. So Neville says, do not compromise, and there is no neutrality that is possible. Either you adopt the way of imagination, or you're going to be led by your senses, which is only going to tell you of what is the past. Because what's out in our environment is stuff we've created in the past. This is what Neville says in the text. He who is not for me is against me. What this actually is talking about, imagination. If you are not working with imagination, you are working against yourself. You are working against imagination as well. Because if you do not utilize imagination, you will be creating stuff that is actually not going to feel okay, will be out of alignment, and it's going to feel like a struggle. Because if you want to create that dream life, you've got to know how to imagine. But it's not enough to know how to imagine. Imagine better than the best you know. And look around you. Who are the people who are the best at imagining? Assume that you can imagine better than them, because then you can create a better world for yourself and for others. So observe your imaginal activities and live from the wish fulfilled, which means live as though you are that person who has that dream house, who has that dream job, who has the ideal relationship. Now, when I was looking at becoming an imagination coach, I didn't just look at what course do I need to take, or what do I need to study, what do I need to learn. This all began from within me as a vision, a feeling, a burning desire. I knew I really wanted to actually help others with the law of assumption. And so 3 years ago, when I started to see the results for myself, I went on to apply it so that I could create an international presence. I created and I saw a vision of my YouTube channel. And I also saw this vision of having clients who work with me from all over the world. And I have a private membership podcast. So I wrote my first book last year. I wrote and published my first book last year. It was my lifelong dream. And I have many other things that I aspire to. But I also know that it is about this inner transformation of becoming the person, of being that person already is this, who already has that dream life, who already wakes up knowing it is given. I have faith in the unseen, and that's what imagination is. A miracle is only required by those who do not have faith. Neville tells us that imaginal acts and not blind faith determine the course of history. Now, I want you to also remember this. Your imagination will also determine the course of your future. The world is imaginal. It is not mechanistic, which means there are no mechanisms outside of you that make anything happen. There is no external power outside of you. You, my friend, are the operant power. You operate the law of assumption through your imagination, through employing, through putting your 5 senses into the state of the wish fulfilled, to telling your 5 senses not to take in the outside or external cues, but to become the person who feels, sees, hears, imagines, but become the person whose senses are fused, the spiritual senses are fused into the imagination, such that the physical senses do not take in and they do not believe what is happening outside. When you can do this, when you can see that your imagination creates reality and that the world is imaginal, you will shorten the period of time that you wait in terms of your manifestation, in terms of your desires becoming true. This is where Mrs JRB prepared for her stately habitation by imaginatively sleeping in the wish fulfilled, the one that said she already had her home. And we're going to go into that now. A few months ago, my husband decided to place our home on the market. The main object for the move which we had discussed many times, was to find a home large enough for the two of us, my mother and my aunt, in addition to 10 cats, 3 dogs, and 1 parakeet. Believe it or not, the contemplated move was my husband's idea, as he loved my mother and aunt and said I was at their house most of the time anyway. So why not live together and pay one tax bill? I liked the idea tremendously, but I knew that this new home would have to be something very special in size, location, and arrangement, as I insisted on privacy for all concerned. So the side notes on this is everything starts with a clear desire. Define your aim, and that's what emerges in this first paragraph, is that the couple decided to place their home on the market, and they had in mind that they would combine their home together with the wife's mother and aunt. But the wife already knew that she wanted something specific in mind. And so she goes on to say, so at the moment, I was undecided whether to sell our present home or not. But I didn't argue, as I knew quite well from past experience with imagining that our house would never sell until I stopped sleeping in it. So here is an important point that the wife makes, is that she was undecided about whether to sell their current home or not. And she knew, though, from past experience that using imagination would be key in terms of selling the house. Because if one is dwelling in a certain state of consciousness, that is the consciousness that hardens into fact. 2 months and 4 or 5 real estate brokers later, my husband, in quotes, had given up on the sale of our house, and so had the brokers. So this is quite important because she spoke about the fact that only once she stopped sleeping, only once she stopped dwelling in that house, would the sale go through. And she goes on to say, at this point, I had convinced myself I now wanted the change. So for 4 nights in my imagination, I went to sleep in the kind of home I would like to own. On the 5th day, my husband had an appointment at a friend's home, and while there, met a stranger who, in quotes, just happened to be looking for a house in the hills. He was, of course, brought swiftly back to our house, which he walked through once and said, I'll buy it. This didn't make us very popular with the brokers, but that was all right with me, as I was happy to keep the broker's commission in the family. We moved within 10 days and stayed with my mother while looking for our new home. So herein you see that the shift happens when she now goes into imagination and sleeps in the new home, and she dwells in the new state of consciousness. And the bridge of incidents here is her husband was at a friend's home and he meets a stranger there who was looking for a house in the hills. And he was brought through, looked at the house, and decided that was perfect for him. So this was the bridge of incidents in terms of the sale of the house. We listed our requirements with every agent on the Sunset Strip only, and in brackets she says, because I wouldn't move out of the area. And each of them, without exception, informed us we were both mad. It was entirely impossible, they said, to find an older English style with 2 separate living rooms, separate apartments, a library, and built on a flat knoll with enough ground space to fence for large dogs, and located in one particular area. When we told them the price we would pay for this house, they just looked sad. I said that wasn't all we wanted. We wanted wooden paneling all through the house, a huge fireplace, a magnificent view and seclusion. No close neighbors, please. At this point, the lady agent would giggle and remind me there was no such house. But if there were, they would realize 5 times what they were willing to pay. But I knew there was such a house because my imagination had been sleeping in it. And if I am my imagination, then I had been sleeping in it. So here we now see staying true, persisting, not looking at external or 3D events or 3D feedback, but to stay true to what you are living within and from in your imagination. She goes on to say, by the second week, we had exhausted 5 real estate offices, and the gentleman in the 6th office was looking a little wild when one of his partners, who had not spoken until then, said, "Why don't you show them the place up King's Road?" A third partner in the office laughed sourly and said, "That property isn't even listed. And besides, the old lady would throw you off the property. She's got 2 acres up there and you know she wouldn't split." Well, I didn't know what she wouldn't split, but my interest had been aroused by the street name, for I liked that particular area best of all. So I asked, why not just take a look anyway, for laughs? As we drove up the street and turned off onto the private road, we approached a large 2-story house built of redwood and brick. English in appearance, surrounded by tall trees, and sitting alone and aloof on its own knoll, viewing the city below from all of its many windows. I felt a peculiar excitement as we walked to the front door and was greeted by a lovely woman who graciously asked us in. I do not think I breathed for the next minute or two, for I had walked into the most exquisite room I had ever seen. The solid redwood walls and the brick of the great fireplace rose to a height of about 28 feet, terminating in an arch ceiling joined together by huge redwood beams. The room was straight out of Dickens, and I could almost hear Christmas carolers singing on the balcony of the upstairs dining room, which looked over the living room. A great cathedral window gave a view of sky, mountains, and city far below, and the beautiful redwood walls glowed in the sunlight. We were shown through a spacious apartment on the lower floor with connecting library, separate entrance, and separate patio. 2 staircases led upward to a long hall opening into 2 separated bedrooms and baths. And at the end of the hall was, yes, a second living room opening out onto a second patio screened by trees and redwood fencing. Built on 2 acres of beautifully landscaped grounds, I began to understand what the agent had meant by saying, in quotes, she wouldn't split. For on 1 acre stood a large swimming pool and pool house completely separated from the main house, but undoubtedly belonging to it. It did indeed seem to be an impossible situation, as we did not want 2 acres of highly taxable property, plus a swimming pool a block away from the house. So up until this point now, what we are seeing is Mrs. B staying true to her imagination, and she's now feeling her imagination come to life as she walks through the house. So continuing through the text. Before we left, I walked through that magnificent living room once more, and looking down, saw my husband standing by the fireplace, pipe in hand, and with an expression of perfect satisfaction on his face. I placed my hands on the balcony railing and watched him for a moment. When we were back in the real estate office, the 3 agents were ready to close for the day. But my husband detained them, saying, "Let's make her an offer anyway. Maybe she will split the property. What can we lose?" One agent left the office without a word. Another said, "The idea is ridiculous." The agent we had originally talked to said, "Forget it, it's a pipe dream." My husband is not easily annoyed, but when he is, there is no more stubborn creature on earth. He was now annoyed. He sat down, slammed his hand on the desk, and roared, "It's your business to submit offers, isn't it?" They agreed that this was so and finally promised to submit our offer on the property. Now, here are important points. Do not give in to the illusion of 3D. No matter what you hear, no matter what people are saying to you, stay true to your imaginal scene. Stay true to your ideals. Stay true to your desire. Continuing with the text, we left, and that night, in my imagination, I stood on that dining room balcony and I looked down at my husband standing by the fireplace. He looked up at me and said, "Well, honey, how do you like our new home?" I said, "I love it." I continued to see that beautiful room and my husband in it and felt the balcony railing gripped in my hands until I fell asleep. So these are important points. She took the feeling and the sensation of what she had experienced when she visited the house, especially that of seeing her husband by the fireplace. Now she brought in the dialogue, "Well, honey, how do you like our new home?" And she says, "I love it." And she continued to sleep, seeing her husband in that beautiful room and feeling the balcony railing gripped in her hands. Now, this is where spiritual sensation is what charges up our imagination. So, spiritual sensation is feeling with your senses, hearing, seeing, touch, smell, whatever that may be, bring it all into your scene. Continuing on, the next day, as we were having dinner in my mother's home, the telephone rang and the agent, in an unbelieving voice, informed me that we had just purchased a house. The owner had split the property right down the middle, giving us the house and the acre it stood on for the price we offered. JRB. So there are many points here in terms of staying true to your assumption hardening into fact. The lady here said that she imagined sleeping in the house for 4 nights, and then on the 5th day, she actually had the opportunity to go and see the house. Now, she followed this naturally in terms of the bridge of incidents, asking the agent to take her through, going and meeting the owner, seeing her husband in the house, not giving up to the external no, but following through on her internal yes. Please leave your comments, insights, and or questions that you have about this week's video. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much. This is Fazila Bijo, and this is the Imagination Creates Mastery podcast. I look forward to having you join me in the next video.